The defeat of the communications hub in Crimea led to a temporary loss of communication between the occupiers and some of their troops. This was reported on the air of the telethon by the representative of the Ukrainian Navy, Captain 3rd Rank Dmitry Pletenchuk. According to him, they hit a communications hub in Crimea, which is located on the territory of the 184th Scientific Research Experimental Base, Sevastopol. Mutual opposition continues constantly. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Crimea, representatives of almost all components of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, including the Navy, have visited. Of course, this is far from the last target, that is in Crimea. In addition to the fact that there is also logistics there are still control elements there. Despite the fact that the main part of the naval composition has been withdrawn from their main base in the temporarily occupied Crimea, this does not mean that the control bodies cannot remain there further. But this case that you recalled the defeat on August the 11th, this is the control center. This is not the first such loss. Pletenchuk said. He added that the said node is an important element of military infrastructure because communications is the command and control of troops. In fact, Pletenchuk emphasized, this is one of the elements of warfare, and the loss of control, although temporary, significantly affects the quality of task performance. According to the military man, Crimea is technically within the range of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, but the enemy's counteraction should be taken into account. Therefore, despite the fact that the Ukrainian Navy can technically reach the entire territory of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, it is not easy to destroy the corresponding targets. The enemy has very densely saturated the peninsula with its air defense. Therefore, some defeats may be successful, but some may not be successful. Therefore, this counteraction still matters. But this does not mean that we are going to stop. The number of objects that can be destroyed in Crimea is quite large. This time it was actually Sevastopol, but this is how we were able to avoid collateral losses. I mean, civilians, explained the captain of the 3rd rank. He stressed that this is about Ukrainian territory and Ukrainians, so the defense forces are trying not to hit their schools, and they are succeeding. As reported, Ukrainian forces struck and damaged another ship supporting Russia's war effort on the Black Sea. Another ship strike isn't remarkable. In the 43 months since Russia widened its war on Ukraine, the Ukrainians have sunk or damaged roughly a third of the Russian Black Sea fleet's 36 warships. Most notably, the cruiser Moskva, holed by 2 Ukrainian Neptune anti-ship missiles way back in April 2022, recalls Euromaidan Press media outlet. What's notable about the last strike on the project MPS V07 rescue and salvage ship was how and where Ukrainian operators hit it. The 73M salvage ship, operated by Russia's auxiliary rescue agency, was patrolling just outside the port of Novorossiysk in southern Russia, 400 kilometers from the front line. Rather than send a squadron of comparatively slow drone boats or expand a precious cruise missile that might cost $1 million or more, the Ukrainian Military Intelligence Service, the HUR, flew a fixed-wing attack drone at very low altitude all the way to Novorossiysk and struck the project MPS V07's bridge area where many of the most delicate electronics are. The hit on the project MPS V07 had the effect of destroying its electronic warfare systems and forcing it out of action, the Ukrainian Strategic Communications Service announced. The raid came just 2 weeks after a Ukrainian drone team scored a hit on a Black Sea Fleet missile corvette in a similar way by maneuvering an attack drone at wave-top height and striking the corvette's topside electronics. Blowing up topside radar masts and satellite receivers with a small drone might not sink a ship, but it can inflict a lot of difficult-to-repair damage and at low cost and risk to the attacker. Even the priciest attack drones cost just $200,000. Most are in the range of 5 figures. Euromaidan Press says, it's worth noting that the project MPS V07 is an ice-hardened vessel with a reinforced hull for sailing through icy northern waters. All that extra steel makes a project MPS V07 a harder target than, say, a thinner-hulled missile corvette. In that context, the attack on the vessel's electronics makes even more sense. Until recently, the waters around Russian-occupied Crimea were protected by one of the densest air defense networks in the world. Dozens of Russian radars, mobile guns, surface-to-air missile vehicles and batteries, including long-range S-300 and S-400 SAM sites. But now they have been destroyed. Russian ships have become easier targets. In these circumstances, these ships now prefer to flee to avoid Ukrainian strikes. The campaign of Ukrainian strikes against Russian oil and gas infrastructure not only deprives Russia of its main source of funding for its aggression, but also destabilizes the socio-political situation in the Russian rear, just as Russian society was destabilized on the eve of the February Revolution of 1917. Forbes writes about this. The publication notes that Ukraine tried to hit the aggressor in this vulnerable spot back in late 2023. But then the Biden administration, fearing the rise in world oil prices, effectively vetoed this strategy of Kyiv. In the summer of 2025, Ukraine began a new campaign of strikes against Russian oil refineries and pipelines. This time, when Washington no longer objected to such strikes, the campaign brought significant results. According to various sources, Russia lost from 17% to 20% of its oil refining. This has caused significant fuel shortages and rising prices on Russia's domestic market, increasing social pressure on the Kremlin as ordinary Russians increasingly feel the effects of the war. Ukrainian drone strikes on oil refineries achieve what sanctions alone could not. Moscow has found ways to adapt to Western sanctions, but so far it has no reliable defense against Ukrainian drones, explains former advisor to the Ukrainian Defense Ministry Serhiy Kuzan. As Forbes notes, Russian propaganda cannot ignore the queues at petrol stations in many regions of Russia, but tries to explain this by the consequences of increased seasonal demand for fuel and unscheduled repairs of oil refineries, only occasionally admitting that the reasons for these unscheduled repairs are destructive drone debris flying freely over the European part of Russia. On September the 4th, Putin was forced to admit that Russia faces a gas shortage, suggesting that the country turn to coal reserves, which will last for almost 1,000 years. Russia's oil export revenues fell in August to a 5-year low of $13.5 billion, Reuters reported, as exports declined and Urals crude traded at $56 a barrel, below the $60 price cap. The Kremlin faces a delicate balance. Its war in Ukraine demands ever greater funding, yet the economic pressure is growing. The central bank has done an impressive job stabilizing the economy so far, but its tools are limited. Businesses are already strained by high interest rates meant to contain inflation, and rising fuel prices add to the pressure, threatening to upset that balance, Forbes said. And all this is happening against the backdrop of a gradual deterioration in the overall economic situation in Russia. As the author of the publication notes, these attacks on refineries themselves will not end the war, but they are shaping its trajectory. Putin often positions himself as the heir to the Tsars, rebuilding an empire, but he should remember Tsar Nicholas II during World War I, when overextended fronts and domestic shortages made domestic unrest as dangerous as an enemy abroad. Forbes concludes,